So that concludes my opening remarks. And with that, it is my pleasure and honor to introduce Mark Calabria, board member, a newly minted board member at the PCAOB. Mark's got a long and distinguished history. He's an economist, and so has brought a refreshing view from that perspective to the work of the PCAOB and the importance of what you all do to our capital markets. So without further ado, happy to introduce Mark Calabria.
Thank you, Kent. Much appreciated. Good morning. Really such a pleasure for me to be here, especially I'm only about, I think, 3 months into my term, so you beg your indulgence while I still try to learn some of my ways around the board. But certainly the first thing I have learned is, like Kent, I have to give a disclaimer or the lawyers aren't happy. And as we've all learned, you got to keep the lawyers happy. So let me read this real quick. While I am here in my official capacity as a board member of the PCAOB, the views I express today are my own and do not necessarily reflect the views of the PCAOB, other board members, or PCAOB staff. You know, in fact, after I give my views and I give them further thought, they might not even be my views anymore. But in all seriousness, I want to thank the staff, the team that really put this on today. Really has been, I think, incredibly smooth. We have a number of staff from many of our divisions, inspections, enforcement, standards head, and so I hope you get an opportunity to visit with many of them between the breaks and at the lunch. Since, as I mentioned, I am relatively new, before we kind of get into some substance, I thought I'd really share with you a little bit kind of my philosophy and how I'm going to approach being a board member, partly because I think the board should strive to conduct itself in a principled and consistent manner. And in fact, I think we should be so predictable we should be boring. You should be able to figure out if the question is X, we're going to do Y because this is the principles that are guiding us. Now, of course, to behave in a principled manner, you've got to have principles to begin with. So let me talk about my first guiding principle, and not to sound a bit hokey, but I really do look at the most important principle of leadership is humility. And the most important leadership of a regulator is humility. We have powers exercised to us by Congress. You know, for instance, we have the ability to bar individuals and firms from the industry. That's a big deal. We can end people's careers. And if we're going to do that, which I hope we never have to do that, but if we're going to do that, we need to make sure we approach that with the exercise of caution, humility, due diligence, and due process. We also have to be thoughtful about what we understand and what we don't understand. There's lots of things that I know that I don't understand about the board, about the industry. There's even a few things that I think I understand that I'm going to find out later are probably wrong. That's life, that's learning. And I think we should just endeavor to be an organization that constantly seeks input from external stakeholders like yourself. So I do want to encourage all of you to reach out to us, give us feedback. You know, we're going to have a number of things open for comment at some point, but we have a regular comment email, and I'm going to give that later to you in the address. But you should be able to tell us what you think is going on. Again, we might not agree, but it's important we hear it because if we don't ever hear it, we're never really going to think about it. And that allows us to subject our own views to scrutiny. That said, the one thing, at least among a couple that I am extremely certain of, is our authorities come to us from Congress. So regardless of whatever my personal policy preferences may be, I'm going to first and foremost be guided by the directives and responsibilities that have been placed upon us in Congress. To kind of simplify it, at the end of the day, whatever the question's going to be, I'm going to reach over and pick up my copy of Sarbanes-Oxley and say, what does the law say? That's my guide, that's my compass, even if I disagree with it, because again, that's my responsibility. Kent mentioned I'm an economist, so I do bring the lens of an economist to the board, and while I am continuing my education and auditing issues, there are some economic lenses I'm going to bring to that. First and foremost, everything we do at the board has benefits and costs. You know, there are no free lunches, except I think in a couple of hours we may be having a free lunch. But in general, there are no free lunches. So when we set standards, when we set an inspection regime, we set an enforcement regime, there are always pros and cons. And so one of the things I'm going to try to bring to the board is to make sure, are we maximizing the benefits relative to the costs? Because ultimately, those costs are borne by investors. They're borne by you, they're borne by your clients, they're borne by the marketplace. And again, to me, it's always going to be a recognition of, before we add some cost somewhere, I want to be convinced that the benefits exceed those costs. And so those should kind of be my first and foremost principles that I'm going to look at when we make decisions on the board. Because again, you play an important role in our capital markets. We play an important role in our capital markets. I hope you had an opportunity to hear some of the comments that were made at our first open board meeting a few weeks ago. But I really do want to echo my agreement with our chair, Jim Logothesis, that the PCAOB needs to get back to the basics, back to the fundamentals of audit quality, investor protection, and disciplined responsible oversight. Again, this isn't a platform for us to put our policy views outside of that. It really is going to come back regularly to audit quality, audit quality, audit quality. So I guess maybe to a little bit of news, I am here today in Chicago to announce that one of the board's near-term projects is to make our broker-dealer audit program permanent. So again, this is at some point, I hope this time next year that we will no longer have an interim, but have a permanent program. And today I see is the beginning of a dialogue for you to help us understand what that permanent program should look like. As a reminder, in 2010, Congress expanded the board's authority to include audits of broker-dealers. The Dodd-Frank Act amended Sarbanes-Oxley to give the board this authority to establish a program of registration and inspection for auditors of broker-dealers. Under this authority, the board oversees the audits of broker-dealers, not broker-dealers themselves. As you may remember, in 2011, under that authority, the Dodd-Frank, the board adopted the interim broker-dealer program and inspection program under Rule 4020T. The lawyers make me do all these citations, so just go with me on that. And again, we're 15 years into a temporary program. So some of us believe that 15 years is long enough to perhaps look at making it permanent and giving you predictability so that you know what the program's going to look like going forward. As a reminder, in 2013, the Securities and Exchange Commission adopted amendments to its Rule 17A-5 to strengthen and clarify broker-dealer annual financial reporting requirements and also facilitate the ability of the PCAOB to implement the oversight of auditors of broker-dealers. In response, we at the board adopted two attestation standards, the much beloved AT1 and even more beloved AT2. Come on. I know it's still early, and I guess I should say, if you need a couple of minutes to grab another cup of coffee, I'm not going to be offended. Those attestation standards are really such a foundation for us in terms of compliance and the exemption reports required by the SEC. So for broker-dealers who are required to file the compliance reports under 17A-5, auditors perform those exams. In performing those exams, the board's attestation standard AT1 requires auditors to obtain reasonable assurance about whether the statements made by the broker-dealers in his compliance reports are fairly stated in all material respects. For broker-dealers who are required to file exemption reports, auditors perform reviews. Unlike an examination engagement, a review does not result in an opinion being formed. As a result, is substantially less in scope than an examination. We've been operating under this broker interim program, again, for over a decade, 15 years now, almost. And while I believe that the interim program has served an important function, we've learned a lot from that. I'm not sure I think we're going to learn much more by just keeping it interim. And I think our continued engagement with the SEC, FINRA, and from the markets themselves have really led us to a point of saying we need to take what we've learned and we need to make a final program and a permanent program in that. Of course, with the ultimate goal of making sure that we are protecting investors. Let me emphasize that I believe broker-dealers play a vital role in our financial system. They're essential to market functioning, capital formation, and when it comes to investor assets, when broker-dealers are holding cash and securities, the stakes for individual investors are very high, we have repeatedly learned. Audit failures in this space are not just technical issues. They can have costly consequences for investors. And Congress made our mandate clear to protect investors and the public interest by improving audit quality. With that mandate in mind, the first important question to me, which I hope you give considerable thought to, is a reminder, of course, that Congress gave us considerable flexibility in which types of broker-dealers pose the greatest risk to investors. And so that certainly will be a question that we hope to get feedback on in the days and months going forward. Where should we as the board focus our oversight of auditors to better protect customers of broker-dealers? Both the Commission and FINRA play crucial roles in the landscape of regulation in which broker-dealers and operators operate. Their regulatory and inspection efforts directly over broker-dealers play a critical role in protecting broker-dealer customers against the threats from fraud to churning. And we all have to acknowledge that there has been fraud in this space, which of course was the inspiration for Congress to pass this authority for us to begin with. So we needed to think about how do our roles at PCAOB interact with the functions that FINRA and the Commission operating. And we certainly will be in regular communication with the Commission and FINRA as we think through this process. But again, I want to emphasize we want to hear from auditors, we want to hear from broker-dealers, and all interested stakeholders as we try to figure out what this landscape should look like. Again, I want to emphasize that I think the role of auditors is critical here. Auditors perform the audit and the examination engagements, again, to provide reasonable assurance related to broker-dealers' financial statements and, if applicable, the compliance reports. Auditors also perform review engagements to provide limited assurance, where applicable, related to broker-dealer exemption reports. Then, in turn, we at the board endeavor to do our job to make sure that auditors under our purview are following our standards as they execute audit, examination, and review engagements. This differing level of assurance raises questions. Should the PCAOB oversight in the broker-dealer space be the same for all broker-dealers, whether they file compliance reports versus those who simply file exemption reports? How should the board balance addressing investor risk against our fundamental goal to minimize inspection gaps with the Commission and with FINRA? How do we protect investors without unnecessarily burdening smaller audit and broker-dealer firms? Are there categories of broker-dealers under the current oversight that may not be necessary, that need to be recalibrated under the current set of rules? One area where this balance is especially important is our thinking about customer custody. Customer asset risk is highly concentrated among a very small subset of broker-dealers. These firms are comparatively few in number, but they account for the vast majority of required net capital and a very high share of total assets. Thus, is there a meaningful difference in risk between broker-dealers that handle or hold customer assets versus those who do not? As we move forward, I believe we should carefully evaluate whether board registration and inspection efforts are appropriately focused on the auditors of broker-dealers that provide custody of customer assets, and where the risk to investors is most direct and significant. At the same time, we should thoughtfully consider whether a different approach for inspections may be appropriate for broker-dealers who do not handle, receive, or hold customer funds or securities. I want to remind you that Congress anticipated exactly this opportunity of tailoring. Through the Dodd-Frank amendments, the board was given the authority to differentiate between broker-dealer business models when designing its oversight program. The law even contemplates potentially differing treatment for auditing investor broker-dealers who do not handle customer securities or who are not members of SIPC. As we move forward, tailoring our broker-dealer inspection program and making it permanent, I look forward to discussions on the best way for the board to use that flexibility wisely. Because that flexibility is not a loophole, it is a tool, and we should make sure we're, again, balancing the costs and benefits of the current rules, whatever our new rules may be. As you know, under our current rules, we issue one report annually that summarizes our entire broker-dealer inspection program. I know everybody, I can't remember what time of the year that comes out, but I'm sure that's high on favorite seasons. Our board is focused on transparency. As a board, are we generating useful information from the annual report? As the board thinks through how best to make the broker-dealer inspection audit program permanent, one question that is interest of me is whether we should be moving more toward a model that looks very similar to our issuable program, where we issue firm-level engagements, reports on an annual basis, and how do we make those more useful to consumers? As an economist, again, there are only trade-offs here, no free lunches. Congress gave the authority to inspect, investigate, and set standards for the auditors of SEC broker-dealers. Since that authority is granted, the board has executed on that mandate. But it does come at cost. For example, the broker-dealer share of the board's accounting support fee in 2025 was $29 million. That accounting support fee is paid by broker-dealers, who pass on some, if not all of that cost to the customers. So again, everything we do ultimately is borne by other market participants. And the question we need to regularly ask ourselves at the board is, are we providing value? Are we improving market functioning? We have a responsibility to steward those monies carefully and to invest them where they bear the most bang for the buck. I'm interested in understanding how we can further evaluate whether those efforts are worth their cost. So said another way, does this increased investor protection outweigh the costs? I believe that the board is at an important moment, a moment to step back, listen, and design a program in the broker-dealer space that reflects both what we have learned and where the risks may truly lie. Over the coming year, I expect the board may consider proposing a release, including, again, a request for comment related to the permanent broker inspection program. I can commit that you will continue listening, engaging with auditors, broker-dealers, investors, other stakeholders to ensure that we build a program that is not only effective in theory, but is workable in practice. So to get to where we need to go, I and the board need your help, and maybe more. First, continue to be patient with us as we work through the process. Second, stay motivated and continue to be engaged with us. We need your input to get this right. I think if we do get it right, we can achieve the two goals of stronger protection for investors and a regulatory framework that is appropriately tailored and sustainable for the industry. Finally, before I take questions, the board has issued a request for comment on our strategic priorities. I look forward to hearing from you as we develop the board's 2026 to 2030 strategic plan, which will guide our future standard setting activities. We actually have an email, which again, you can send something to, and that's comments@pcob.org. So I hope you send us some comments, either on the broker-dealer, on our strategic priorities, or in fact, anything you happen to be thinking about that you maybe think of interest in the board. So again, let me emphasize, in bringing the lens of economist, I'm always going to think about the trade-offs, and always going to think about how do we maximize the benefit we provide to investors and how do we minimize our burden on the capital markets. So with that, we're going to have a little bit of discussion, a little bit of Q&A that I think Kent's going to lead us on.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Well, thank you for that, and look forward to any questions. Reminder, feel free to send any in, and we'll work through them as we can. But first, let's start for the first CPE code for this session. It's 672. 672. 672. So with that, I thought, as the questions roll in, why don't we start sort of what you ended with, and that's the first, the board's commitment to transparency as reflected in putting out for comment at the earliest stage, before we even get to a new strategic plan, which you mentioned is what the priorities for that strategic plan and for the board should be, and requesting comment from small firms, large firms, issuers, broker-dealers, investors, really just the general public. So I just wonder, maybe you could talk a little bit more about that, why you think it's important, why the board decided to do that so early, and then just additional ways you think that some of the smaller firms represented here can participate in the process moving forward.
So first and foremost, let me really emphasize that we wanted to the best of our ability to expand the universe of who we hear from. Of course, we know we're always going to want to hear from audit firms across the space, but we want to hear from audit committees. We want to hear from investors. We want to hear from stakeholders writ large, and we want to understand what has the board been missing? Have we been focusing on the right priorities? Have we been transparent about it? And I really feel like that there's a true commitment in this board and my colleagues to being as open and transparent as possible. Now, I've spent most of my career at actual government regulators doing Administrative Procedure Act, where you have to do notice and comment in a certain number of days, and you have certain rules around it. And while the board has considerable flexibility to essentially, in my opinion, sometimes fall short of that, I want us to be as transparent about it, because again, at the end of the day, we don't always know the right answer. We don't always, and even if we've decided that a certain objective needs to be met, that doesn't necessarily tell you what the easiest and best, most efficient way to get there is. And so again, reemphasizing, because I did mean it 100% sincerely, how do we bring humility to how we operate? How do we make sure that we are hearing from stakeholders? Again, we certainly expect every commentator and stakeholder to make their case, You don't get just, doesn't do any good just to complain. You got to complain with a direction and say, this is how I think this can be made better. And what you're getting from me today is a commitment that we're going to listen to that, we're going to weigh that, and we're going to see if there are things that we can do better. And so I think that there's a sincere commitment. And I think, again, while I don't speak for the rest of the board, I will simply say my reflection of the rest of the board is there is a very strong across the board commitment to being more engaged with external stakeholders and to being more transparent about what we're doing.
I think that's right. You had mentioned, I mentioned my initial very brief introduction of your background as an economist. You reflected it on a little bit in your comments, and you just mentioned your previous experience as a regulator. So I wondered, for those who aren't scurrying to look up your bio on the PCAOB website right now, if you could talk a little bit about not just your background as a trained economist, but your previous experience as a regulator, and maybe some of what you've learned and what that might bring to bear in your new role as a board member.
So, let me start with the observation that for whatever reason and whatever wisdom, Congress decided that the board would be limited to 2 CPAs, and that the rest of the board would be non-CPAs. It looks like to me that historically the non-board members ended up being mostly lawyers. And I don't want to suggest that you can ever have too many lawyers involved in the process. It could never be the case. I think I'm the first economist on the board, and I really do see a lot of commonality. I mean, at the end of the day, what does a good economist and what does a good auditor do? You take quantification and you add judgment to it, and you try to determine causality. So I think conceptually, a lot of what's trying to be achievable in the audit space is the way economists think about things. And I think this is particularly helpful today as we see AI and other technologies and other data analysis push the auditing profession to be more and more quantitative. So for instance, among the handful of jobs I've done, I served last year as the chief statistician of the United States. So that was the role at the White House. We actually who knew America had a chief statistician? But the point being is I think we're going to see more and more of the profession move toward a greater quantification, and I think that's a great thing. But at the other hand, I know I've seen it in the economics profession where I think it's probably gone overboard, where many academic economists many economists are just essentially mathematicians. And I think it's important that we maintain for the audit profession the importance of that judgment. I don't want to see you become a bunch of mathematicians, and I like mathematicians, which is a bit unusual to say, but all that said, because at the end of the day, making those judgment calls is what makes you a professional. And I've seen in my career watching the economics profession where it's become increasingly quantitative, and you often lose the judgment value about the industry. Like a really good economist, like a really good auditor, I spent much of my career working around the industries of finance, real estate, and just as a good auditor, you have to have a deep understanding of the industry of the issuer. And you're not going to get that out of a model. Honestly, you're not going to get that out of AI either. So that importance of that judgment. And so I bring having seen how I think over quantification has squeezed out judgment in the economics profession in a bad way, in my opinion. So I want to make sure we don't do something similar. As a side, I think we're seeing a course correction in econ, where you have to have that understanding of the business in which you're operating, and then I mean not just the auditor, I mean the issuer that you're examining. So I think that's an important quantification of it. But again, I think you have someone coming to the board who's got a fairly good grounding in quantitative methods to understand where they can be helpful, but it's just as importantly to understand their limitations, because there are very real limitations. And you're never, and we at the board, we're certainly never gonna, the auditor is always gonna be responsible for the answer at the end of the day. You're never gonna be able to point to the model and say, well, that's what the model told me. No, you have to be able to judge and say, what that model spitting out makes sense to me? Is it consistent with my judgment and my experience and what I've seen? So how do we, again, harness those tools, and we've seen them done in other areas. Now you mentioned I have, I was the regulator for Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, which of course, as you may know, 2 of the largest restatements in history have had their own auditing problems over time. And having regulated from an actual government regulator, I recognize, we, the PCAOB, are kind of this quasi-government, quasi-not, which brings interesting wrinkles to it. But understanding that how do you have a perspective where you as the regulator are setting, a very straightforward set of rules and predictability? I always go back to, and it's funny because I know I kind of picked on lawyers a little bit earlier, but I always go back to what I think is one of the fundamental principles of contract law, which is you read ambiguities in a contract against the party that wrote it. And the relevancy here is we write the rules. We have the responsibility not to be ambiguous. You can't rewrite something if we haven't written it clearly. So I do take it on, it's the board's responsibility to make sure that what we're asking you to do is transparent and that you can predict it so you're not, I don't want to have a guessing game, Maybe to end with, a finer point of philosophy, and for those of you, and you have my sympathy, this is you because you're in my camp, which is you occasionally like to read books on public policy, and if you fall in that camp, I'm a big fan of Robert Rubin's book that he wrote during his time as Treasury Secretary called An Uncertain World. I'm a big fan of it because I think the underlying philosophy of it is so wrong. And what is the underlying philosophy of it? His philosophy is regulators should maintain maximal optionality so they can respond to every opportunity. But if we maintain a maximum optionality, you never know what we're going to do. It's a guessing game. And so I kind of look at it this way. I really do look at my objective ultimately for the audit profession is how do I help you spend less time with your government affairs officials, less time with your general counsel, less time with your compliance officer, and more time with your clients, but doing it in the right way. So again, I think we can get there in that perspective, and I've certainly seen how the burden of regulation can shift the market. And I also want to emphasize part of the perspective I bring to this partly as an economist is I really spent a lot of my time and spent a lot of my career thinking about market structure. And one of my obsessions is always going to be, and I suspect many of you are from the Big Four or other firms, I want to make sure that what we're doing as a regulator is not unnecessarily driving consolidation in the industry. There are going to be other reasons the industry may consolidate. I think AI has an interesting perspective on leveling up some of the smaller firms, but obviously to make the investments, you've got to be a bigger firm. So I'm not going to dictate, and I don't think it's the role of the board to dictate what the structure of the industry looks like, but I think it is our role to make sure that we're not unintentionally driving trends in the industry. That should ultimately be driven by marketplace dynamics. So I think you are going to I see me bring a perspective as a board member in asking, what's the impact of what we're doing on the market structure of the industry? And I suspect that has not necessarily always been a priority before.
Okay. Well, thank you for that. And I want to pull on the thread you mentioned a couple times on AI, the use of AI, both within the profession and at the board. But first, before we get into that, we'll cover our second CPE code for this session is 234. 234. And again, that's 234. So on that, it's been mentioned both in the first open meeting where the board put out for public comment, it's what should be the PCOB's strategic priorities. The chairman has mentioned, you have mentioned, and others that a big priority for the board will be the use of technology, both at the PCOB and upping our game in the use of technology, including AI. You can't go a day without reading in the papers how AI is extending itself throughout all different markets and industries, professions, including the auditing profession. So just, your general viewpoint on AI, the use of AI, and whether you want to talk about that in the perspective of how the PCOB can better use it in technology or the market as well. Just be interested in your views on that.
So let me first, add the wrinkle that, my background is not simply economics. I'm a little bit of an obsession with economic history. And so I like to read and think about throughout my career kind of how we got to where we were. I can still remember, and I think there's one or two of you in the room old enough in this case. So, my mother was an accountant, and I can remember her bringing punch cards home when I was a little kid. And so this is just to say, the industry has been through repeated technological shocks, and some of them seem quite small, but you even think about the ability to search a PDF rather than, and I'm still a bit of an old school guy, you go into my office and I've got a bookshelf of physical books, so I guess that makes me a little bit of a dinosaur. But when you even had to move from no longer flipping through paper to where everything was more online, and even when standards became searchable on the internet.
The introduction of Excel.
Exactly. These were all positive productivity shocks and changes to the industry that required people to learn and required things to do differently, but ultimately made the industry more and more productive. So I just want to first and foremost say, I'm a big fan of AI, but this isn't the first technology change we've been through, and it won't be the last. I think it will represent a lot of challenges for the industry. Again, maybe not to date myself, I think the biggest challenges will be helping people at the top of the firms to perhaps a little later in their career who may not be as technologically savvy understand what the technology is doing. Because at the end of the day, they're going to be responsible because, again, one thing we're never going to change at the board is regardless of the technology, you were personally responsible for the judgment that goes into judging the output of the technology. And so how do you make sure that you've got the appropriate controls in place, the appropriate culture and the appropriate process in place where those at the top of the firm who aren't necessarily doing this day to day understanding or comfortable with the answers that are being given. And we've obviously seen this. We were all familiar with the stories of some legal case where somebody submits a brief and it references, some case that never happened. And so, how do you make sure you're minimizing those, hallucinations? How are you making sure that? Because again, at the end of the day, what we're trying to figure out is causality. So, data tools, machine learning, AI are really good at capturing correlations. But again, not to repeat the cliche about correlation's not always causality, but it's a place to start. So you're going to have to make sure that what you're looking at is not some data anomaly. So I think it'll be a transitional phase. I think it will bring a lot of efficiency, and I think we're already seeing that. In some of the areas, I think it will be the things that are, easiest to go through. So I put this, I really look forward and excited about the day where somebody writes an AI program that can translate my handwriting to normal English. And so again, if you've got work notes and handwritten, translating those, stuff like that, I think will have a very big impact on the industry. But it's certainly here to stay. So we at the board need to understand enough of the technology so that we can make sure that it's meeting the standards. We also need to understand enough that when the industry comes to us and says, this standard is inflexible for the technology we're using, that we're in a position to judge that. And we're in a position to help craft perhaps a new standard in some areas. I would say for myself at this point, it isn't obvious to me what we need to change yet in terms of standards, but I say that I'm extremely open. And again, we hope that some of the commentary in our strategic planning process is where the industry tells us where are the inflexibilities from us that are standing in the way of technology adoption? Where are we the barrier to you being able to be more efficient in technology? And that's one of the things we want to find out. And sure, in some of those instances we might be, but we can't change that. And then other instances we'll be like, that's a really good point. Let's do it differently here. And so again, I think there's a lot of opportunity. But I also recognize how do we manage expectations. So I suspect every single firm is coming under pressure from issuers who are saying, why should I pay you so much when you could run a program to do half the job? And you have to explain kind of like why that isn't always the case. And we want to make sure that we're transparent in helping issuers and the rest of the capital markets understand both the promises as well as the shortfalls and limitations of the technology. Yeah. So we will be building out more in this space at the board.
Great, thank you. I'm going to go through
another code.
No, actually, let's do it. Let's do it. Yeah. Okay. So when a board member speaks, I listen. So we're going to do another. No, it's all right. So the next code actually is 586. 586. 586. Going through some questions some additional questions that have come in rather than those that came in previously, and thank you for those who sent in some questions previously to get things going. Do other board members share your interest, the desire to make the broker-dealer inspection program permanent? And are you aware as there been any dialogue with the SEC regarding any such plans?
So with the usual preface of, I don't speak for any other board members, and I definitely don't speak for the commission. So I'll give you my impression of that answer, which is I believe that the rest of the board is very sympathetic and is on board, no pun intended, with finalizing a broker-dealer program. That said, and we're not prejudging the outcome of that process. I think the board consensus really is to finalize the program. We have not begun, the nitty-gritty of how does board member A feel about this aspect and board member B feel about that aspect. And I recognize that I think the last attempt was 2019, 2020 to maybe try to finalize a broker-dealer program, and the board abandoned that. So I think we're pretty early in the process, and I think there's a broad commitment. I will point to that I know the SEC chief accountant has made several public statements about the broker-dealer program. I would point you to those. Yep. I think they speak for themselves. But I think there's a very broad consensus to finalize the program. But I do caveat, we're very much at the beginning, and whether there's a broad consensus on every dial, I think that remains to be seen. I think that there is, and so I'm very optimistic. I guess I'll put it this way, I've done a number of rulemakings at agencies. I've been involved in a number of these things, and I can assure you personally, if I didn't think there was a chance of finalizing the broker-dealer program, I would be running away from it and have nothing to do with it. So let that be, as we economists would say, revealed preference, I think is the term for, my actions are demonstrating that I think that there's a consensus and that we can land the plane.
Right. Great, thank you for that. I wanted to talk about something that I know is of great general interest, not just to this crowd, but to the profession in general. Had been mentioned at the open meeting in a number of board members, including the chairman's opening statement, and that is the short-term priority of looking at QC 1000, which the board adopted last year, deferred the effective date until the end of this year, and now it seems to be, without prejudging again, or trying to put myself in the mind of the board or the board members, an interest in seeing if there are any additional improvements that could be made, should be made before the end of this year. So interested in your view on QC 1000, where you think the board might be, and what might be done this year.
So personally, I certainly think we need some narrowing amendments to it. I think we do need to finalize it. I think there's been a number of efforts over the years. I think clarifying and consolidating the quality control standards, I think, would be helpful for the board and for the industry and for the marketplace writ large. There are certainly aspects of the proposal as it is out publicly that I have some reservations about, but again, I don't want to prejudge the outcome. To go back to my earlier comments about costs and benefits, I think there are some aspects of it where the costs outweigh the benefits. And I think we will be revisiting that. Again, I don't speak for the rest of the board, but my impression is that I think that there's an openness to perhaps narrowing some aspects of it. But again, this is an area where it's so incredibly important for us to get public comment on. And let me emphasize, perhaps the obvious, this is a new board. And so I recognize that perhaps what was possible under previous boards or comments that you might have said under previous boards would be different. This is your opportunity. Again, the worst case is you send in a comment and you ask her a bunch of stuff that we can't do in Impossible, and I read it, and that's the end of it. But the best case scenario is you send us something, hopefully with supporting analysis and data that can inform us, and we can actually try to do this the right way and be informed. So I do want to commit to you, we're going to go through every single comment. We're going to be very thoughtful about each and every one of them. And the more information you give us and the more argument you give us, I think the better we can be about this. So there is a broad openness to where we want to end up on QC 1000. And again, this is the time to start submitting commentary. Again, comments at pcobus.org. And again, they don't have to be limited. We almost certainly have something out at some point under QC 1000 where there will be a specific comment period. But again, I don't want you to be necessary to feel like you need to wait till then.
Yep.
get started today.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, let me just make sure so I don't forget. We'll give the last CPE code for this session. Excuse me, is 293. 293. 293. We've got about 5 minutes, so we have one last question that's come in I want to make sure we cover. I'll summarize here and then just give you an opportunity if you have any final closing thoughts as well. But this is just trying to get inside the mind of Mark Calabria. It's treacherous waters, perhaps. But generally speaking, what do you have any thoughts about when you think about the broker-dealers versus the issuer world and the different structure of who might ultimately own them and how that informs you, whereas issuers are ultimately owned by the investors who invest in them. The broker-dealer might be otherwise owned by a parent, and where are the investor risk for a clearing or a custodial broker-dealer versus an issuer, and just how do you frame that up as you begin this process, thinking about what's appropriate or not appropriate in the broker-dealer space?
So first and foremost, and again, reemphasize the importance of us hearing from public comment. We obviously have an interesting relationship with the commission. Let's say. Mm-hmm. So there's always going to be an interest in what the SEC is thinking. Now, fortunately, we didn't go through my bio, but I spent a little time on the Senate Banking Committee. I was 2 doors down from my colleague Hester Peirce, who's now commissioner. I've known Paul Atkins for probably close to 20 years now, and have known Mark Ueda for a very long time. So we have a very good relation with the commission level. And we do, while we maintain a degree of quasi-independence, anything we do on the standard setting and rulemaking front ultimately needs to be approved by the commission. So there's always going to be a back and forth for us to try to figure out what does the commission think. And the interesting thing about the broker-dealer program is it's not simply a question of what does the Office of the Chief Accountant at the SEC thinks. It's also what do the people managing the broker-dealers think. So I think there's an added wrinkle with this one in that we're not simply, we're so used to, I think, engaging with one aspect of the SEC, which is the Office of Chief Accountant, that sometimes we lose track of. There's the rest of the commission, and we need to engage with the rest of the commission. And
there's FINRA as well.
And FINRA, just to get that, and SIPC. And obviously, and one of the things we do also want to achieve is, more outreach to places like SIFMA, where the broker-dealer community directly to hear from. And so I think this one, and it may be why this one has kind of gotten stuck in the mud in the past, there are a lot of competing interests in this program. And again, I've got my fingers crossed and I'm hopeful that they all can be balanced and we can get to a reasonable place. But it does mean that there's a lot of process and a lot of hand-holding with our peers to try to understand what their interests are, and then obviously informed by what the public and what external stakeholders are thinking. But again, we're beginning that process. We're having these conversations, and again, it does mean everybody's going to have to give a little bit. So no one's going to, myself included, no one's going to get 100% of what they want. But and I also want to emphasize, also kind of my philosophy. It's interesting. I'll note on my bio for those who haven't looked at it. I've spent part of my career running Federal Housing Finance Agency. If you didn't notice, I got the Supreme Court put me out of that job. So there was, you can't always say. And then I spent a little time at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, and now at the PCAOB. For those constitutional law geeks, I've served at all 3 agencies that have been the Great Removal case. And the relevancy here is, the reality is the board's going to turn over every time there's a change in politics at the White House. Just the reality. But that reality does not mean that we are stuck in coming up with rules that swing back and forth. And in fact, a point of pride I take when I look at my time at FHFA is when I left, my successor changed almost nothing I did. They built a bunch of other stuff, sure, because they can have their priorities. So in addition to us trying to thread the needle with the commission and FINRA and SIPC, I want us personally to land in a place where future boards have very little interest in redoing it all. I mean, part of coming up with moving from an interim to a permanent is truly having it permanent so that you know what the rules are. So that also does mean that, maybe if it was just me and I had a blank piece of paper, I'd be all the way over here, but that's not where we're going to be. We're going to be, how do we balance all those interests and constituencies, and how do we come up with a permanent rule that truly is permanent so that the next board has very little interest to come back and redo it. So that is part of the objective as well. Because again, I don't think it serves you, I don't think it serves the broker-dealer community if we just swing back and forth on how we do this. So I'll keep that in mind as well, that we want to try to become to a place where there's certainty for the industry and certainly for the marketplace. At least that's kind of how I approach it.
Great. Well, that's all covered sort of some things that I know folks would generally want to hear about. So we covered the questions that came in prior to the event, covered the questions that have come in during this session. So if you have any final closing remarks, happy to hear them. If not, we're close enough that we can shut things down and folks can get their CPE.
So
please.
A friend of mine who's a business professor, and maybe those of you who have experienced this when you went to business school, always likes to start out his remarks saying, I'm going to tell you what I'm going to tell you, and then I'm going to tell you what I'm going to tell you, and then I'm going to tell you what I told you. And so with that in mind, I'm going to repeat again, please send us public commentary. We are incredibly open to wanting to hear what people are thinking. Even if it's like, some hobby horse you've been stuck with for years and you think no one's going to listen, go ahead and send it to us. Again, I can't guarantee you we're going to implement or change anything in that regard, but this is a very open board. And we want to be very thoughtful about kind of where we can make changes and make improvements. Obviously, yes, everything you should suggest to us has to be within our statutory authorities. It doesn't do me any good to ask me to do anything that's illegal. Not going to do that. And anything that I think that we can actually, implement in a transparent way that's going to help the marketplace. And so I do want to emphasize that I think this is an opportunity for the public and for the industry to really lean in and give us some thoughts. And there truly is, this is not a board, certainly speaking for myself, we haven't gotten everything baked and said, oh, we're just going to get here. I certainly have seen it way too often in Washington. When somebody starts a rulemaking process, you can already tell they've decided where they're going to end up, and it's just a dance. And you're asked to comment and participate, and it's just a process where it's already been decided. That is not the case here, and I mean that 100% sincerely. We're open to learning and doing things differently, but again, I kind of, I'll leave you with this. There's an old saying in Washington that if you're not at the table, then you're on the menu. And I think if you think about it, you get what that means. And I want you to be at the table. And I want you to be able to weigh in and talk about what we should be thinking about. So with that, I really appreciate your time here this morning. Personally, I'm not much of a morning person, so I understand if you had to have 3 or 4 cups of coffee, I felt the same way. So again, and if you're ever in Washington, please come by and see us sometime. We do want to hear from folks. But again, thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you all.